welcome to this week's book club episode of Star Wars Dark Disciple by Christie Golden. We're going through this book a couple of chapters at a time to really dig deep into the themes and happenings. If you would like, check the description. You can join us from the beginning of this book. But otherwise, we're going to dive into chapters 4, 5, and 6 today. We start out on the level 1313. I get really excited whenever we talk about the level 1313 because level 1313 was almost a legendary place. In fact, it is now a legendary place if you follow Legends. Obviously, it still exists in canon. We see a lot of level 1313 as well with like the newly released season of Clone Wars that came out at the top of this year. So there's going to be a Star Wars video game called 1313. Fallen Order kind of stole some of that, in like designs from it have kind of permeated into other Star Wars projects, but the project was ultimately shut down because it was in development at the time of the Disney buyout. There was also going to be a live action show. Long before we had The Mandalorian, George Lucas had ideas for a live action show as far back as the panel, just things of Rick McCollum talking about it at like the celebration for episode 3. And it was going to be about the underworld and take place on level 1313. So all of these things were kind of in motion for a while and kind of rumors of development. And so Clone Wars brought in level 1313, which we saw in some of its original run. We saw in some of its revamped run for Disney Plus, and we're seeing in this novel. And so it's this mythical level, well, not mythical because it exists, but it's this cool underground level on Coruscant where all of this stuff is going to happen just because it's cool to call it 1313, presumably. So just the fact that this was being set there was really neat. I liked Voss saying that the Jedi would wonder about the people who lived down here, who would probably never see the surface and wonder if they would see their whole lives there. And that also ties into the Martez sisters that we would eventually see in the Ahsoka Alone episodes, I think is kind of the unofficial title for that arc. Now, Voss is a very interesting kind of Jedi. We've seen that exemplified in the first 3 chapters, and we're seeing that here, that as he walks around, he does kind of like the neuro mind wipe thing. Like if you think about Men in Black, he's just doing that with the Force as he goes around, and kind of erasing any kind of knowledge that he was ever there. And this is an interesting use of the Force. He reminds me a lot of a class of Jedi that existed in Legends canon called a Sentinel, which comes out of the Knights of the Old Republic games. There was like the Guardian, who used a lot of combat techniques, and the Counselor, who was more about Force stuff, and then the Sentinel was like Jedi with skills, and it sounded kind of dorky, but it was actually really cool. It was always the class I played as when I played the first KOTOR. And he kind of has this idea too, that they're not somebody who's pursuing knowledge within the Force, and they're not somebody that's like out there actively defending people, but rather using the Force in these kind of offbeat ways to do the dirty work of the Jedi, I guess. I mean, this is the type of thing where, you know, if Anakin was walking around wiping people's memories, people would get really concerned. So there's this subsection of Jedi that kind of got away with doing stuff that was more actively manipulative. I think it's easy to read this not necessarily knowing all the context and go, this is just like the Jedi abusing their power, and in a way this is a lot of what people probably, like people within the galaxy kind of feared the Jedi might be doing that caused them to be afraid of it. But if we think about this, like, obviously this is something that exists in current canon, Disney era canon. Obviously it was adapted and brought into Disney era canon when it was written, but when the episodes would have been written, the ideas that are going around, and again, I don't know which ones are Goldens and which ones come from the scripts. This is all being pulled from, like, written at a time when Legends was canon. So to look at it in this context, I don't think this is necessarily a case of us thinking that Voss is trying to abuse his power as much as this is kind of the special thing he gets to do as a Jedi Sentinel. But I also think that you can see it that way, or I certainly do, but also view it as maybe there shouldn't have been Jedi that did things like this to begin with. It makes me think a lot of Mace Windu, who was not considered a Jedi Sentinel in canon, or in Legends canon as far as I'm aware, but he walked that line with the dark side where he got to do some things and play with the Force in a certain way that wasn't typical, because he was Mace Windu, because people kind of trusted him to be able to handle it. And it seems like, at the very least, whether you want to look at this and say that this is a problem with the Jedi as a whole, or a reflection of his class of Jedi, that Voss is clearly somebody who is trusted with things that not a lot of other Jedi would have been. But those two diversions aside, let's actually talk about the story. So Voss walks in, he finds Bosk and Boba and company. This connects to Clone Wars, in obviously because the characters are there, but like we've seen Ventress kind of hanging out with the squad in the past, so it makes sense that this is how Voss would get any kind of information about her. I was excited to see Embo because Embo is my favorite. I love the hat. We see again Voss is kind of like nudging them a little bit, or nudging Bosk specifically to be like, hey, we're buds. He specifically says that he tries not to use the Force to influence Boba, not necessarily because it's wrong, but because it won't work. So again, we're seeing that Voss is kind of a walking an edge kind of guy. He's able to get through to them, and they tell Voss where he can go find Ventress. Boba says, like, this guy doesn't know what he's getting himself into. And of course, Voss thinks to himself that that's half the fun. I think it tracks that they would be so willing to give up Ventress and give up a bounty, not necessarily because they actually like this guy as much as they're all just really upset at Ventress. And so, to me, it tracks that that would happen. Then we hop over to Ventress's perspective. So after all of this time hearing about her, we're actually going to see her. She's looking for this mark, and we get some good connections. She's, you know, as she's looking around in her scope, she spots a family, and it makes her miss her own family on Dathomir. We see the destruction of the Night Sisters in the Clone Wars, in one of the last Ventress arcs, if not the last Ventress arc in the actual show. And it just kind of shows where Ventress is, because she's not necessarily the most emotional, like, chummy person, but sisterhood means a big deal to her because her sisters took her in after Dooku cast her out. She does eventually catch her quarry, which Voss tackles, and that tackle leads to the guy getting away, which is what we see in Chapter 5. And we start Chapter 5 and 6, which is really largely a bit of a, well, Chapter 5 especially would have been a big chase scene. It would have been an action sequence. So she loses the bounty because she ends up knocking Voss in the face, or punching Voss in the face, knocking him out, that sort of thing. She notices that he's attempting to flirt with her, and she calls it atrocious, which I think is really funny, because Voss kind of talks about the character he's come up with for who he's playing, as he interacts with Ventress, which he says is largely himself except for the flirting, and I like to think that Voss thinks he's doing a good job of it, and I don't think he's necessarily trying to play bad at it, but maybe he is a little bit, but I think it's funny. And what's funny too is if Ventress thinks that Voss is bad at flirting, that must mean she thinks Obi is good at flirting, and I just think that's kind of great. But there's our street chase. There's a lot of connections to the Clone Wars, just being on a planet from Pantora in general, the Narglatches, that sort of thing. And those probably would have been there if we were watching the show as it was, and it wouldn't really be references because it would be referencing itself, but it's just kind of fun to hear from and see a lot of the stuff again. Ventress is impressed by some of Voss's skills. She notes that he can hear really well, so Voss is not really doing the best job at playing the complete idiot, unless maybe, again, that's part of his plan. I'm not actually sure in reading this how much of it was Voss intentionally trying to just let a little bit of competence through, or how much of it was him just being that competent and he couldn't fake it that long. But it's an interesting thing to think about, and of course we weren't reading this from his perspective. I mean, he's just kind of relentless. He comes at her and is just intentionally antagonizing her with his doofishness, which is really kind of, like, I guess it's either frustrating or hilarious depending on who you care about more. Like, if you're a big Ventress fan and you don't really know who this Voss guy is very much, I could see this part being really, really frustrating on her behalf. If you're a big Voss fan and either as much as or maybe not as much of a Ventress fan, you know, this could be kind of hilarious. It's one of those things though where it's obnoxious, but he's like intentionally being obnoxious. I think he's intentionally trying to play into the arrogant male showing up the woman type to come across that way, to hide his true intentions, but it also is a little bit annoying, and it's kind of interesting to see, or try to guess which line he kind of falls on when he does that. I appreciate that she just refers to him as the idiot before she knows his name. She chases her bounty, they struggle, she briefly loses her bow from her sister, so we see her kind of, again, struggling with that family connection. Voss saves her from her fall and insists they should work together, and that she's the one who failed, not him. Ventress is over it and marches off for a drink. Chapter 6, Voss tails her to the bar, and here we get to see him kind of like actually be in his element and try not to get made. It doesn't appear like he was on his way there. She's so tired that she lets him sit next to her, but she's definitely still angry about everything that's happened. And as they start to get a conversation going, that's when Obi-Wan calls, and so Voss has to sneak away and take his call. And it's this point where I wonder, like, does no one in the Jedi Order text? Like, can Obi not just send a, hey, how's it going? Do they not even have beepers? Like, everything has to be a call? I don't know, I just think that's kind of funny. I feel like so much of Star Wars being dependent on, like, visual communication like that, like how Star Wars got FaceTiming before they got beepers, is kind of reflective of the era it got made in, right? Like, in the 70s, it was really cool to have video phones, so everything became video phones, and no one really could conceive of a world where one day we would all get our phones and, like, text like this, you know what I mean? It's just kind of funny to me when I read this space alternate universe. But he comes back and gets real with Ventress for a second. He realizes he's at that point where Ventress is evaluating him, and he's gonna pass or fail. And the entire mission rests on that moment. He also gets to read a piece of the bounty's clothing that Ventress pulled off of the guy, and he can use his psychometry power and gets a tip, and he has to pretend like he didn't get it from holding the item, and he's still kind of juggling all of that. I like how they say that she wouldn't pick up on him using the Force because his Force is just so, like, the Force is so ingrained in his, or his ability is so ingrained in the Force that she wouldn't necessarily pick up on it. He passes her evaluation, and they end up teaming up. So they get to the place where Voss thinks their quarry is going to be. He manages to find the apartment. He's trying to not show his hand, but it's also kind of difficult because Ventress is a bit impatient. She thinks, you know, he got a location instead of a bunch of pictures in his mind. They find the apartment, though. She has her bow back, which is good. She uses it to slide down to the apartment, but Voss has to, you know, pretend that he's not a Force-sensitive guy and kind of lumber down the building. So again, he's trying to balance those two things. They knock on the door, and it sounds like somebody's home, but they don't know who, and that's where the story leaves off. So basically what we got here was Voss on the hunt for Ventress, and then their meeting and their beginning of their partnership, even though we haven't really gotten to the part about Dooku yet. So that's really what I have to say about this stuff today. For next week, let's read chapters 7, 8, and 9. That's 7, 8, and 9 for a week from today. Please let me know what your thoughts are on the story so far, and leave me a comment. If you're not already, follow us on all the socials, and I will talk to you guys next week.